Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm Heather Hayes, a pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA, and I will be your moderator for this morning's show. As this past summer came to a close, the airwaves were inundated with pictures of refugees fleeing the violence in Syria. As Europe scrambled to respond, the question of the United States' involvement and support was raised. The response was mixed here in the United States. There were those who called out words of welcome and those who took a more guarded stance to any involvement and support in a resettlement effort. Forward then on into November, when in the wake of the attacks in Paris, governors across our land vowed to resist resettlement of Syrian refugees in their state due to concerns that these mostly Muslim groups would harbor terrorists. In December, presidential candidate Donald Trump, in his characteristic style, declared that he wanted and would support, I quote, a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what is going on. This remark, which he presented as a written statement and has since verbally supported, touched off a furor, as some sought to distance themselves from what they felt was a provocative statement, even as the idea of some sort of religious litmus test for entry into the country was being bandied about. We have a great panel here this morning to talk about this idea of a religious litmus test for entry into the United States. To my immediate left is Hassan Selim, the imam at the Islamic Center here in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Next to him is Jim Leach from the University of Iowa, and also Jeff Cox, a professor of history at the University of Iowa. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Welcome.
Obviously, the impetus for this particular show is grounded in some of Trump's remarks about the moratorium on Muslim immigration and visitation, but actually the idea of a religious litmus test for entry into the country more broadly includes speech around the refusal of Syrian refugees and others who have called for a block on visitors from nations that have what they would call radical elements in them. However, they may define that radicalization. While these may not be overtly saying the word Muslim, they are using in some ways what I believe is sort of a coded language to identify particular groups of people in other countries. A question for you all to maybe talk about is, where do you think this rhetoric is coming from? We are in an election cycle, and I can only imagine that the public figures are very aware of how their comments will be received. What is this that you think they are speaking to, or that they think will appeal to at least some parts of the American public?
Well, I think that since the 9/11 events, and even before that, Islam as a faith and Muslims as well has been used for fear mongering and to promote fear, to eventually gain some political points and credit, especially around election seasons. And therefore, myself as a Muslim, as an imam and a leader of a Muslim community here in the United States, I was not very shocked where when the rhetoric started in the recent couple of months. So it is something that we are kind of getting used to as Muslim communities here in the United States. At least that's from my part. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to answer your question directly, but before doing it, let me mention that Cedar Rapids, Iowa is a model Muslim community.
Yes, it is.
The oldest mosque in North America, and one that is really integrally brought into the community. And one of the aspects of the Muslim faith is a great deal of emphasis on charity. And people from this particular mosque have been very charitable to the community with active participation in community drives, for hospitals, for community centers, libraries, et cetera. And so that have anything to do with Cedar Rapids are immensely appreciative of the mosque and very respectful of it. Now, in terms of your question, it isn't something that emanates exactly from the political process, but it's been reflected in the political process. And you have kind of a mutually reinforcing set of concerns. And with some understandable reasons, the American people are concerned about terrorism. On the other hand, from the Muslim perspective, it's a very tiny percentage of people that are involved in this circumstance, and many Muslims don't like the word Muslim associated with the terrorism because they believe these are people hijacking a faith and are not being true to the faith. And so you have vocabulary that has come into dispute. But if we look at American history, and I think we'll get into that, and Jeff might want to comment first, but on the whole, America has had a long progression of welcoming other people. And then we've had some aberrations that are embarrassments to our history. But let Jeff respond on that.
Well, right. I think, one of the problems of being a historian is that we get frustrated with a kind of historical amnesia, and it's a kind of professional hazard. Stirring up. Congressman Leach referred to certain aberrations, but stirring up hostility to religious minorities is not really an aberration. I mean, it's really a part of deeply embedded in American politics. And whenever I see these attacks on Muslims, I can't help but think about the very long, really dating from the 1840s right up to the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960 of political anti-Catholicism, which pretty much been forgotten in America politics, but it lasted right into my lifetime. I mean, growing up in a small town in Texas, I really remember the antagonism toward John F. Kennedy based on his Catholic faith. And this was not just a matter of bigotry. I mean, there were real concerns about people about whether you could be a good Catholic and a good American. That whether Catholics would really respect the First Amendment, that whether Catholics could go to public schools because they were dissatisfied with them, whether they were going to learn to speak English because a lot of Catholics were Italian or Polish speakers, and also the whole question of the First Amendment and the relationship of church and state. And John F. Kennedy, I remember very well, I had family members who are people I knew, former congressmen. I remember standing in the parking lot of the First Baptist Church of Stephenville, Texas. He was an old New Deal Democrat. He was a segregationist, of course, but he was a really partisan Democrat. He said, I just don't think I can vote for Kennedy. I just don't think I can do it. And it wasn't bigotry. It was some real problems with the Roman Catholic religion. When John F. Kennedy addressed the Houston Ministerial Alliance in 1960, this was a real turning point in American history, when he explained how he could be an American and a Catholic. And I think that election was a real turning point in American history. I think political anti-Catholicism kind of disappeared. It really kind of evaporated. Kennedy carried Texas by 40,000. Some people say stolen votes. But, Al Smith got massacred in 1928 when he ran against Herbert Hoover. So I think there are sort of analogies here. So people are worried about how you can be a Muslim and how you can be a good American, and those things have to be explained. We have to talk about them. And I think that's what we're doing here. And
But let me mention, I totally agree with Jeff.
Yeah.
But this larger question is about the other, someone that's a little different. And at the beginning of our history, we killed many Indians, took their land. We brought slavery to the United States and treated people of a different color differently. We enticed Chinese to come and help build the railroad infrastructure and treated them very poorly. Then you have anti-Semitism is not unknown in this country. In 1939, after World War II had broken out on the continent, we turned away a ship called the MS St. Louis. It had 908 German refugees from the Holocaust. They were returned to Europe. Over half were lost in the Holocaust. That is really an unpardonable circumstance. And then during the war, World War II that is, we incarcerated Japanese Americans, many of whom were Christian, many of whom were not. These are embarrassments in our history. And we've learned from them. I mean, Jeff mentions, and I think one of the great aspects of America is that we've made some advances in tolerance, and particularly Catholicism is now totally mainstream. And I think it won't be long before Islam will be, but it's going through a rough patch at the moment.
You know, you have Mormonism. I thought we were going to have a big debate about Mormonism when Mitt Romney was nominated,
Right,
because
right.
there is a lot of deeply rooted prejudice against Mormons, and it didn't happen.
That's right.
It didn't. I was really surprised by this.
So there's
and
hope for us yet.
encouraged by this. I think it just, you know, there were some little fringes of it on right-wing Christian talk radio, but not much. Not much. It just didn't come up.
You know, you've talked some about stated concerns. Are there other sort of more hidden concerns with issues of economics, with job opportunities and things in which it's easy to perhaps scapegoat another, and under the context of a religious difference that you've also seen historically?
Well, of course, there's a long history of anti-immigrant politics in America. This goes back. I think Mark Twain somewhere has an essay about why it's a waste of time to read newspapers. And he said he went back and read a newspaper in San Francisco in the 1850s, and guess what? There's a crime wave in the city. There have been some disasters, earthquakes, and immigrants are taking American jobs, right? I mean, but that I think is really more targeted to Spanish-speaking people. I mean, I think the real nastiness of the attacks by our own Congressman Stephen King and also by Donald Trump that Mexicans are rapists, this is ramping up the kind of real almost hatred of Spanish-speaking Americans as a whole class. And I find that very disturbing. And I wish there were more voices in the Republican Party speaking out against that. It's not, you know, I think the issue of Islam and the American Muslims is a different issue, really. I mean, I don't think the refugees from the Middle East are really, I think people are worried that some of them are going to be terrorists and they won't be good Americans and so forth. But I mean, the response to these 40,000 children and teenagers who showed up on the border as refugees from Central America, this was just horrifying to me. I mean, I think that, you know, if you want to talk about ethics or Christianity, I mean, you know, welcoming refugees, it seems to me to be a fundamental obligation of an ethical person. And boy,
Well, we'll have to do another show on that
yeah,
one.
okay.
So I'm going to pull this back around a little bit, because one of the things that you brought up within the concerns about Catholics was that idea of, can you, as a Catholic, and hold certain areas in faith, but still participate in civic discourse and have some sort of separation between the two. And I think I hear quite a bit in, again, the rhetoric around can a Muslim hold fast to the tenets of their faith, but yet participate in civic discourse. And I think sometimes we hear this conflation as people look at some of the rhetoric that happens in the more radical or co-opted areas of the Islamic faith. And they say, well, you know, look at what they're saying over there. Can we even trust our neighbors over here? And maybe not in Cedar Rapids, but but in other places. So can you speak to a little bit about how?
Yeah,
To answer this question, we have to mention that estimates range, that the number of Muslims in the United States is somewhat between 5 to 12 million, American Muslim, and that's quite a significant number, and therefore, and it's increasing. It's increasing by immigrants, and the Muslims number of American Muslims who are already here are increasing, because it's even despite what we are hearing, the rhetoric that we're hearing because of the elections, Muslims feel that they are welcomed here, and they feel safe, they feel free to practice their faith, and so on and so forth. So what this means is that there are conversations, like Professor Jeff mentions, that we will have to talk about. They might not be comfortable. We might not be comfortable having them right now, but they will lead to a good understanding of what Islam is and who Muslims are. And even there is a conversation that is taking place right now among the Muslim community itself, the American Muslim community, of what does an American Islam look like? What does it mean? We recently had the first American Muslim liberal arts college that was accredited. So it is the first in the nation. And I anticipate that the number will increase as there is more demand of Muslims receiving their traditional education in terms of Islamic studies and so on and so forth, but at the same time also receiving the traditional liberal arts education that other students will receive in other universities around the country. And therefore, what this means again is that people will need to understand that Islam teaches Muslims to respect the law and to live and to abide by the law of the country wherever they live, whether it's Europe, whether it's the United States, or the Middle East. Muslims have the ability, and that is according to the teachings of Islam. I've been studying Islam for the past 20 years, or if not more, and that is what the Islamic Sharia, for example, teaches, is that Muslims have to respect the law of the country in which they live, and if there is any conflicts, there is nothing in the teachings of Islam that says that you have by force to change the law of the country in which you live. And here we have to be careful not to take groups like ISIS, that does not even represent 1% of the Muslim population of 1.6 billion person around the world. They do not really represent the mainstream understanding of the teachings of Islam, which again invites and encourages Muslims to be good citizens, to be good participants of any community wherever they are. And again, all we need to do is to look at the example of Cedar Rapids and many other examples around America. Cedar Rapids might be significant because of the fact that we've had Muslims here since late 1800 and early 1900. We have the first and the longest standing place of worship for Muslims, and we have the first Muslim exclusive cemetery in the country, in all of North America actually. So these are all things that eventually the discussion will unfold. Eventually people will get to know that these are the facts that we have at hand.
Iman, let me give you an anecdote about some students from your country of Egypt. I once was giving a talk at Georgetown University, and at the end of it, a student from Egypt raised his hand and said, Congressman, what do you think is the most important subject to study in college? And I said, well, I've always just told people, follow your passion. But I said, what do you think it is? And this young student said, well, clearly, it's comparative religion. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, well, if we don't understand you and you don't understand us, how can we get along? That was a very interesting answer. And intriguingly, possibly the first comparative religionist in the United States of America was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson studied all the major religions of the world, and he came to one conclusion, which was just extraordinary. And he said, what matters most is not where the major creeds differ, but where they conjoin. And he then wrote about how they were the points of conjunction. And we've kind of gotten away from that incredibly progressive view of religion that was part of the model of the founders.
One of the chapters in the book I'm working on now is comparing the way young people are taught religion in European countries and in the United States. And in most European countries, not France, but in most European countries and not in the United States, religion is taught in what we would call the K through 12 curriculum. And I've been looking at textbooks in English and German schools, and it pretty much is comparative religion. I mean, that's really, unless you're in a confessional class in Germany, you could be in a Protestant or a Catholic or an ethics class in German schools. Ethics is attended mostly by Muslims, as near as I can tell. And, but what it does is give you a place. There's a place to teach comparative religions. We don't have that in our schools. And in fact, keeping religion out of the schools is, in my view, a good thing. I mean, I don't think we could ever agree. I mean, if you can imagine the school board meetings.
What should be taught.
Right, get that Presbyterian out of there. And, but it raises the issue of where we do talk about it. I mean, we're doing it on this program, and there are interfaith councils.
Right.
But what about young people? You know, what are young people taught? I mean, we teach it in history classes and in religion classes at the University of Iowa, but for our K through 12 students, I wonder if we need to think about this.
Yeah. Where are the spaces in which civil public discourse about religion can happen?
Right.
Across the board. So, question as we head into this, a lot of the different things that Trump has said will flare up for a while and get a lot of attention, and then will die down. How do you think this continued conversation about religion and immigration and visitation to the United States, do you think that will be gone by February, or is this something that's going to keep coming up in American politics at least until the elections finish? What are your thoughts on?
I think we've got a long-term problem. This is a very serious circumstance in world affairs. And one of the things America is going to have to think through is if you have a policy that suggests that a religion should be used as a litmus test for immigration, you're really playing into the hands of the radicals on the other side. And you're setting America up, instead of being a beacon of hope, would be a center of intolerance. And so one of the great questions is how we approach this. And clearly there is a rational reason to have a vetting process of a more rigorous nature than has existed before. But if the country decrees itself to be against any Muslim, we're going to find two things happen. We're going to be attacked much more vigorously around the world, and people will be able to get into this country one way or another. Our borders are porous no matter how much we might think they're not. And secondly, we're going to have a hard time treating with the respect that we should the millions of peace-loving Muslims that live here. That we ought to be bending over backwards to treat in as welcoming a way as we possibly can. And that doesn't mean that there may not be a problem or two that'll arise. By the same token, I'm personally convinced that the more rigorous the antagonism, the greater the problem will be. And so our approach has to be, on the one hand, humanitarian, but that humanitarian approach has to recognize that there are prudent steps that have to be taken within it. And also for those that are doubtful, that rigorous opposition can produce counterproductive results. Whether it be the attitudes that are now being reflected in Europe at this moment about some of the statements being made in the American political process, this is not a trivial dimension. And then if we think we're going to take on certain issues in the Middle East, who's going to want to cooperate with us if we are perceived to be an anti-Muslim country? Nobody. And so for very pragmatic military reasons, for very pragmatic defense reasons of our own homeland, we're going to want to think this through deeper than the shallowness that is being reflected in the political process by some. And the some are influencing others. And so you're seeing comments from leaders in both political parties that are not helpful, and you're also seeing a few somewhat courageous comments. But this is a time for people in public life to reach for some of those higher angels in life, and not simply regurgitate the lower angels that may exist.
Well, let me say one more thing about this. I mean, and people often don't want to hear this, because when I say it, some people will say that this is some kind of justification for terrorism or something like that. But we really need to do something about the extent of the wars that we are waging in Muslim countries. I don't know if it's true, but I saw it asserted that in 2015 we dropped 23,000 bombs on Muslim majority countries.
The President of the United States in the State of the Union suggested 10,000.
Well, I don't know what the figures are.
But
what I do know is this refugee crisis is partly of our own making. That little 3-year-old boy that washed up on the shore of Turkey was coming from Kobani that we had been bombing. They were running from our bombs. And we have created, and Senator Clinton now wants to go to war on 2 fronts in Syria against both ISIS and Assad and more regime change. And until we come to some kind of military settlement in the Muslim world, and I believe all the way from Somalia to Pakistan, we're going to have endless trouble. We're fighting unwinnable wars that don't have the support of the American people, that are creating a refugee crisis. And we really need some leadership. And I'm sorry to say I don't see where it's going to come from right now, but something has got to be done.
Well, we have just another minute. I didn't know if you had another comment that you would like to put in.
I like to look at it from a different perspective. I'm really hopeful that all of what's happening can lead into discussions that, again, as I said earlier, are uncomfortable, but very important for us, at least as Muslims, to go out, to explain ourselves, who we are, and as American Muslims, what we really believe in, and where do we stand from all of what's taking place. So these are all good conversations that will have, the outcome will be hopeful.
Good.
Yep.
Good. Well, we've really just begun to scratch the surface of this issue in half an hour. This is not, as we heard, the first time in our nation's history that a group has been set apart and scrutinized for its religious belief or ethnicity. It is something we struggle with and will continue to struggle with as a country as we balance our diversity and our unity as people living side by side. I can think we all can agree that this is something that's not easily going to be quickly figured out, but instead will take work of continual dialogue on the part of many. I'd like to thank all of my panelists for this discussion and your participation here this morning. It certainly was a good one. And in addition to thanking you, I would like to thank you, our viewers this morning, for watching us today. So on behalf of the Interreligious Council of Linn County, this is Pastor Heather Hayes. Tune in next week as we will continue on with more issue-based discussion. Have a wonderful day.